there's a brand new PlayStation model that was released first in Japan, and people caught wind of it. And basically, it was unclear what those differences were. And uh, as details came out, and the sort of hype around the PlayStation 5 maintained because of lack of availability in general, um, we saw this sort of commotion starting that we wanted to address and talk about briefly. Basically, in midsummer, people caught wind of a brand new PlayStation model, and through the filings, the regulatory filings in Japan, people realized that it was 300 grams lighter, and there was a new wireless chip. But the big mystery was, how does it end up with 300 grams 300 grams lighter than it normally was? What exactly
Helium.
did happened here? Um, at the same time, Sony, I think, within, I don't know, a couple of weeks of this, was like, by the way, we're now selling the PlayStation at a profit, not a loss.
Right.
So something happened in which a new model was produced. That model cut costs for Sony to some degree, and there's a 300 gram weight reduction. And so people were beginning to speculate about this and what it actually means. And the first sort of confirmation of what had happened came from Austin Evans, who very quickly was able to get a new model from Japan directly. They went pretty unscientifically, tore apart the system, broke it down piece by piece to see what had changed. And the big discovery was that the heatsink on the new model was significantly smaller and had reduced materials, in particularly the copper contact plates that were removed in favor of aluminum plates. To his shock, and to many other people's shock, they determined that this can't be a good thing. And the way they tested it roughly was checking fan noise and weighing components and taking thermal shots of the exhaust when it was fully assembled and
The
running.
heat with heat guns. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and they found that the output was a couple degrees higher than the outgoing older model of the PlayStation. And by the end of the video, he essentially claims like, it is not a better PlayStation. You do not want this model. Rather foolishly, but it got clicks. And the scalpers responded appropriately, and they started gouging even higher for the outgoing model, knowing that the incoming model was likely to replace it on all store shelves.
Yeah.
And it prompted Digital Foundry to respond and be like, wait a second, the method that's being used isn't exactly accurate here, to make the claims that he made.
Yeah. There are
So
a number of kind of review sites and hardware review sites that did that.
I think we can cover a couple of points. Why is Austin Evans' method flawed? Um, why does Sony do this in the first place, and how is this different than, say, like a larger revision? And yeah, I guess we can cover like those 3 points.
Yeah.
So
So the first one, go ahead.
yeah, like, why does Sony make model changes? Like, what's the impetus for Sony to go ahead and do this, Eric?
Well, I mean, it is cost cutting measures. Generally, it's ways for them to use different materials or take advantage of new fabrication processes, or cheaper parts or improved parts for that matter. If they find that there's a whole new, for instance, fan assembly that is more efficient and removes, some weight. A lot of people don't necessarily think about the weight as an aspect here of cost, but shipping 300 grams per PlayStation, if you have a pallet of PlayStations and 300 grams, like three of them is almost a kilogram of weight. And you have like, I don't know how many would fit in a pallet, but probably over 100, maybe, I'm guessing here, depending on the size of the pallet. And that's going to be, a number of kilograms. Take that to the millions, and now you're shipping less weight. It's less fuel cost. It's less distribution cost in general. It like that's an aspect that people need to keep in mind, in terms of why they're removing weight and downsizing and trying to make these reductions. You pointed out earlier that Sony at almost the same time said we're now selling at a profit, and I'm sure that the shipping to retail markets and the price reduction from the weight loss there was a factor in that profit recalculation.
Right. Basically, and the cost breakdown, you're gonna have your bill of materials and cost cutting, not just on like components, but on the type of materials. So like copper being a significantly more expensive than aluminum.
Yeah.
And aluminum being lighter than copper. There's a 2x price advantage that you can get by revising the heatsink. Another thing that's worth mentioning in their attempt to cut costs is that they now have like roughly a year of data coming in about performance of the PlayStation and how the final hardware is behaving with the material that they had. So they can now run these things and look at it, and they can collect data from anybody's PlayStation about performance, heat output, all these other things, and make determinations about like what can be revised in ways that are not likely to make changes to the performance and longevity of the console, but also can make huge dents in their overall costs. And like you said, the two biggest ways of doing it are in size and weight. Because like you said, pallets go on a boat, boats ship it. They base payments on container basically, and how heavy that container is. So the more things you can stuff in a container and the less it weighs, the cheaper it is for you to move volume over to your different international markets. How is this different than, say, like the PS4 Slim or the Xbox or the PS3 Slim?
What happens when you get the Slims and the PlayStations is that you have a downsizing in fabrication
in the CPU.
In the CPU, right? Which means that you can pack the same number of transistors in a smaller die. You can reduce the cooling required because the smaller fabrication process generates less heat, typically for the same amount of processing compute power. And that all combines to allowing them to ship, again, a smaller box. So they'll read, and they may change a few things here and there. They may get newer versions of Wi-Fi chips at the same time, just because now's the time. If we're going to redesign to fit a new box, we'll just adjust things. And maybe the new chips are also the Wi-Fi chips that are available now versus 2 years ago are cheaper. So we're going to grab those, and they'll operate the same, but at the same time, they're going to be smaller. So you get that type of mid-generation hardware shift. What has happened is, like Justin just said, like you just said, they've had a heck of a lot of telemetry data come in from users that said, yes, I'm happy to provide you with information from my experience. That data has allowed them to verify that there's apparently been some sort of headroom in their heat envelope for the console, that they maybe over-engineered their heating solution for the initial allotment of PlayStation 5s. And so they're optimizing at this point, and they're taking what, actual data that they've now had in millions of units to be able to make something more appropriate for the actual heat being generated by the chips.
Right. And I should add too, like, for mid-generation refreshes, it almost always follows, like you said, shrinking of the fabrication, which causes they have to redesign anyways after that, because they can't use the same boards.
They're new chips.
And as a result, they're like, oh well, we can shrink everything because power requirements are down, heat requirements are down, etc. And when they usually do the smaller, it means now they can fit 150 PlayStations on a pallet instead of 100. So like it's that sort of change. And this is nothing like that. This is like, how can we optimize? Where can we make cost reductions?
Well, and let's be clear, Sony is going to have some testing units and testing buildings effectively, where they will put together something and then run it and say, okay, here is a worst case scenario. It's in a TV cabinet. The TV cabinet has the door closed. When I run my PlayStation and this new model with the new heating or cooling system in it, does it perform dramatically worse? Does it crash more? Or is it capable of handling the heat that we know it should, based on the telemetry that we're given. And then they can put together a prototype model with the new heatsink and run a battery of tests. All of the hardware these days is tested constantly. The Digital Foundry folks did point out that the original Xbox One launched with a completely over-engineered cooling system that was so over-engineered that Microsoft was able to up their CPU, like in the firmware, they were able to up the CPU and GPU speeds by some marginal amount because there was so much cooling overhead in every single unit that was shipped.
It actually happened with the Xbox Series X as well. It wasn't after launch. It was once they started getting production units, they were able to look at it and go, actually, we have additional overhead.
This cooling is, yeah.
And I'd say Austin Evans proclaiming what he did early on because more heat was being exhausted is not a good indication of that, like, oh, the SoC's cooling. Like, it's like that could be the system is more efficient at cooling, and therefore more hot air is getting blown out because it's taking more temperature from the chip, right? That is not an indication of a worse performing
PlayStation.
Yeah, or the heatsink specifically, right? Like that's what I think is where his line of reasoning came from, and then gave the off-cuff analysis that like proclaimed, oh, this is definitely a worse unit. I should say that to sort of wrap this up quickly is that Digital Foundry worked with Gamers Nexus to actually do some real SoC temperature testing. And they actually broke it down. There's a video out for it. I'm not going to go over the entire thing, but basically they were able to determine that while temperatures are marginally up, it's well within the envelope of the temperatures of the outgoing model. And then Digital Foundry also went into like their performance test, which is using photo mode in control that sort of untaps the GPU or CPU performance. Either way, runs it hard and will uncap its frame rate. And basically, even in a hot box, the performance never dipped.
Right, and to be clear, we're not. I mean, so first of all, Digital Foundry also ran two other games. It was like Resident Evil Village and Godfall, and found the same exact performance across the board. There were like slight deviations that were anytime there was a deviation, it was due to some dynamic process happening.
A process that was not consistent even on its own, even on one console from test to test,
run to run. That's right. That said, let's go back to what I said earlier, where Sony has a test suite for this stuff. They almost assuredly have one of their suites is run some dumb process that puts the CPU and the GPU at 100% usage for an hour or whatever, and see how it performs. Does it crash? Does the firmware like have an error and go and die? That's such a basic concept to be testing. I can't imagine they wouldn't be running that.
Yeah, a multinational corporation as large as Sony that focuses on silicon is not going to have
decades of hardware testing.
Yeah, they're not going to have a dumb fabrication process, one, and two, they're not going to have a dumb manufacturing process that doesn't account for the fact that like these are things that they have to consider, because otherwise they produce a PlayStation that is going to have large scale failures and then they're replacing them. Like that's not within their.
It's very costly.
Yeah, it's not within their QC pipelines or anything like that. That's going to be allowed. So I think Austin kind of ran his mouth a little bit too quickly, and he
might have got him clicks though.
Got him clicks. It also got him backlash. So them's the rules, I guess.